Welcome everyone to the second week of Wheeler Institutes for Business and Development, African History through the Lens of Economics. Before we get started, let me say that Nathan, Leonard, Stelios, and I are extremely honored and privileged for your support, the emails that we have been receiving. We will upload the slides for today's lectures as of last week, say in the course website, and soon we will also upload the videos from last week's. Today, we will continue the discussion we started on week one, where with the help of Chris Ehret, distinguished professor of linguistics at the University of California, Los Angeles, we had a long-term overview of African history through the ancient times. And we will now come to the late pre-colonial period. Today, we are very pleased to have two great guests. Let me start with Alfred Tembu, who joins us from Zambia. Alfred is a lecturer at the Department of History in the University of Zambia. Alfred has done very interesting and exciting research of the history of Zambia, mostly zooming into the colonial and the post-independence period. And I strongly recommend his book, War and Society in Colonial Zambia. Besides, Alfred has been part of a big project that we will present in week 8 that tries to map and compile new statistics detailing the colonial experience, in this case in Zambia, but more generally across the continent. Our second guest today and our great friend is Warren Whatley. Warren doesn't need much introduction to those who have done or who have studied African American history or African history. He is a professor emeritus of economics at the University of Michigan. And Warren has written extensively both about the economic history of Africa, but also about the history of the African American communities in the United States. Most importantly, Warren is currently working on a fascinating book, as he discussed earlier with us, tentatively titled The Making of the Other: How Black Africa Became the Mirror Image of White Europe. Our third speaker is my dear friend and collaborator, Stelios Michalopoulos, professor of economics at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island in the United States. Stelios has done very important work on African economic history. Besides, he has written about the origins of linguistic diversity, an issue that is recurrent in this online course, and also has very recently written an excellent paper on folklore, on how we can take folk tales from Africa, from other parts of the world, and how we can use those folk tales to have something meaningful to say about institutions, norms, and economic prosperity. Thank you all for being with us today. The plan is that Stelios will take the lead for, roughly speaking, half an hour. Then he will pass the floor to Warren and give his perspective on pre-colonial Africa. And Alfred will collect questions from the floor and pose them in the end. As in the earlier sessions, please send us questions. We will try to answer them, some of them in the chat, and Alfred will collect many questions to pose to Warren and Stelios. Thank you all for being with us. Stelios, the floor is to you.
The way I will go over basically what I would like to talk about is kind of our journey with Elias in understanding African economic development over the last 10 years. And it has been really a journey of learning through economists, learning through others, through anthropologists, historians. So it has been fascinating, and at the same time constantly thinking that we don't know anything, we need to learn more. Okay, so here's our hat as economists. What I'm showing in front of you basically is a scatter plot that tells you something pretty obvious, that in better institutionalized countries, that is countries where rule of law rules supreme, courts are working, are effective, the decisions are fair, and the laws are enforced. In these countries, actually, you have a higher GDP per capita. Okay, so that's fine. That's across continent, that's across the world. Now, if we look at Africa, the relationship across African countries is attenuated, but we still get kind of the same picture. Places like Namibia, like South Africa, that have better quality of national institutions compared, let's say, to Congo or Cameroon, they seem also to register higher income per capita. Now, of course, economists, particularly the last 20 years, we have tried to move as forcefully as possible for making statements from, something correlates with another thing, so X correlates with Y, to basically trying to say something more meaningful, that actually X causes Y. So, and there is a huge debate about, whether actually truly it is national institutions variation across countries that matters for economic development, or there is actually a third factor, perhaps the culture of people, perhaps the geography of the countries that makes economic development happen, and national institutions is just an afterthought of more prosperous economies. So, if you read a textbook economics text into, why institutions matter, they would start with a very nice example of basically North and South Korea or East and West Germany, where basically you have kind of historical experiments, same people, same culture, they are exposed to different level of national level institutions, and then they seem to diverge economically. Okay, so that's very kind of strong as an anecdote, but then you start thinking whether with Elias we basically thought, can we say something similar about the African continent? So, and of course, if you look at the African countries, that's the variation basically in institutional quality, roughly around 2000. So you have some, very low quality institutional countries like Congo, DRC, or Somalia, and you have like some pretty good examples like Botswana or Ghana or Namibia that they score very high on national level institutions. Now, as you look at this map, you immediately start thinking, well, of course, there is no, if you wear your hat as a European or as an American economist, you think of these as monolithic countries, that there is no much diversity, but, that's very far from the truth. Because if you actually take out your glasses and you look at the continent, as a continent of, like Chris Ehret told us in the first week, a very diverse continent, then you're going to find yourself in a very different world. So what I'm showing in front of you right now, this is a map that different polygons portray the historical homelands of groups right around the beginning of the 20th century. So this is kind of our best and at the same time, worst understanding of, where you would find, let's say, the Kikuyu, right around the beginning of the 19th century, the Yoruba, right around the beginning of the 19th century. So immediately what basically comes to life when you look at this, so this is by Murdoch in his book in 1959, Africa and Its People, and it was digitized by Nathan Nunn while Nathan was a graduate student, and it has become a standard part of viewing Africa and understanding that the mosaic of its languages and groups. Of course, there is lots of noise, and there is actually work trying to rectify, trying to improve upon this map, but let's say that this is a starting point of the ethnic diversity on the ground, roughly around 100 and 150 years ago. Okay, now, as soon as you look at this map, then you realize that actually this example of East and West Germany and North and South Korea, these tragic experiments have been repeated many times in the context of the African continent. So let's do a little bit of historical background where we are now. We are in a newspaper. The Observer publishes one of its papers in November in 1885. What we were looking at is basically Otto von Bismarck in the middle. He has summoned the European presidents and kings at this point in time in basically Berlin in order to decide how to allocate among Europeans the various parts of the African continent. Of course, as you see on your lower left, there was no African involved in this purely European endeavor. So what's going to happen there in the Berlin conference? We're going to talk a lot about this in a couple of weeks when we talk about the Scramble for Africa. For today, what I want to get out of this unique historical experiment is that starting from this conference in Berlin and culminating over the next decades, borders will land upon colonial borders will land upon African territory. And these borders are basically involving protectorates, free trade areas, and spheres of influence rather than potential states. Nevertheless, upon decolonization, these European borders will become the reality of lots of contemporary African states. So here, basically, what I'm showing you is two maps, like overlaying the underlying diversity of groups and languages as portrayed in the map of Murdoch in 1959. And on top of that, we see the red lines are contemporary national boundaries. Now, as you look at this, you immediately realize that there is a lot of groups that had the fate to actually find themselves split, partitioned into different countries. So these are actually, of course, there is measurement error, and people do move around, but this gives us a first good idea of the extent to which different groups found themselves into different level institutions. Okay, so that's the historical natural experiment. Partitioned ethnic homelands in adjacent countries have, we can actually show that they have relatively similar geographic and ecological endowments. And then we can actually, starting from this observation, we can start asking the question, okay, so now let's say you have the Ani or the Ambo, part of this group is found in a country with relatively superior institutional quality in terms of its government. Is this reflected in the economic development in this part of the group? So how many groups we have that actually have been treated, have suffered from partitioning? It's roughly a quarter of the groups in Murdoch's map. And you may be familiar with many of these groups, like Ani are roughly split between Ghana and Ivory Coast. The Sewa are kind of split three ways between Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. Here is an example. On the left side, you will see the Ewe that are basically almost evenly split between Ghana and Togo. Or on the right-hand side, you see the Ababda, a group partitioned between Sudan and Egypt. Okay, so very interesting. So you look at it and you say, okay, but is it the case that to the extent that basically Ghana has better national level institutions than Togo, is it the case that the part of the Ewe in Ghana is actually more developed than the part of the Ewe in Togo? Because that's kind of what the economic theory or the economic rationale would actually imply. But then we were stuck with Elias for weeks and weeks trying to figure out but how to measure development at this level, right? Because we would like to measure development at exactly this part of the group and not like at some other administrative level or at the country level. And help came from an unexpected source. Help came from above, came from satellite images of light density at night. So what are we going to use? And you will learn much more about, images of luminosity this Thursday by Tanner Regan in his lecture here. But, for now, just think of what we have. We have basically huge photos that give us an idea of how much light comes from a given pixel at any given point in time over the last, starting in 92 up until today. Okay, now how should we interpret light and places with that are emit more luminosity in the night? You should think of it that it's a measure of wealth, a measure of consumption, and measure of production. There is a lot of works that are have been produced showing that places, pixels, locations that are more lit up in the night are actually are much more developed in terms of other measures of income per capita or wealth or education. So we're going to take this as our starting point and use and try to explain and try to see whether actually in the end of the day there is more light on the side of the border with the higher level institutions. So here's how the African continent looks like in 2000. There is lots of unlit pixels, but also some very interesting variation on the ground. Okay, so here is basically the example. Here we look at the Ambo group. The Ambo are split between Angola in the north and Namibia in the south. And you can think of it in like that Namibia on average has better quality institutions, national level than Angola. Is it the case that you get to see more luminosity in the part of the group of the AMBO in Namibia, which is the southern part, versus the northern part in Angola? And in this specific case, you would actually find out that this is true. Well, now, the good thing is that now we have a lot of these examples, right? So AMBO is one example, but we have like, 250 of these instances of groups that are split into different countries. So we can actually ask this question at the broader scale, rather than focus at one group at a time. So what are we going to find? So this is what we're going to find. So let me spend 1 minute to explain to you what you're looking at right now. So, the positive, so on the horizon, on the vertical axis, we have information that tells us what is the probability that a given pixel will actually be lit. What are we looking at? We're looking within historical ethnic homelands that are split by national boundaries. On the positive side, you actually look at the part of the border, the part of the group that falls in the high institutional quality country. So here you would find the part of the Ewe in Ghana, or the part of the Ewe, or the part of the AMBO in Namibia. On the left-hand side, negative values reflect the part of the same group that falls in the low institutional quality country, like the part of the Ewe in Togo, or the part of the AMBO in Angola. Now, as you look at it, you could actually expect that as you cross the border from the relatively low quality institutions country to the more institutionalized, to a stronger national institutions place on the right, so the positive values here. So as you go from negative to the positive values, you would expect to see a jump in luminosity if you were to believe that institutions, country level institutions matter. But this is not what we're finding with Ilias. And then, this kept the project for a while it put a break on the project, because we were saying, how can it be that, we have been trained as economists to think that national level institutions matter, but in the context of Africa, when we look at, all these interesting historical natural experiments comparing economic performance within the same group from one part of the border to another, we're not finding much of a jump in economic activity measured by luminosity. And then actually we started reading much more about what is going on the ground. There are actually very interesting works out there that we have been familiarizing ourselves for the last 20 years. And there is a beautiful paper book by Herbst in 2000, where he makes actually a very eloquent point about how to think about African development and the difference between the hinterland and the urban centers. And one main point that comes out of this argument is that both during the colonial period, but even during the post-colonial period, the state, the national state, the formal state, its penetration further from the main urban centers and the capital cities was actually minimal, and it is now that it is actually developing. And then actually, so this was eye-opening for us, because being trained as someone that thinks that countries like, let's say, Germany, like France, or even the US, that are, federal laws penetrate everywhere, reach every place in Germany, every place in France. This is very different if you start thinking seriously about the landscape of a given African country, where it does seem to be the case that the national level characteristics, they are important and relevant close to the capital centers and in the capital centers and the main urban hubs. But then as you move away, actually these influences of the formal state seem to dissipate. Now, is this true in the data? So what we actually did to answer this question was actually to look at the subset of groups. So we're still under the same experiment. We're looking at groups that are both sides, they are found in different countries. But now we're going to ask the question, let's look at groups that both sides, on both sides of the border, they're near the respective capitals of the countries they belong to. Okay, now if you do that, and so on your left side, you will actually find that groups whose partitions are found close on both sides to the capital cities, then indeed, if you are close to a capital of a highly institutionalized country, let's say South Africa, then indeed luminosity will jump compared to the same part of the same group on the other side of the border. And however, if you look far from the capital, that is basically, you look at places at the hinterland where groups on both sides of the border, they're respectively both far from the capital city, then you actually see no difference as you cross the border from one side to another. So, this actually was kind of a wake-up call for us, saying that, look, you should stop thinking of, whatever we call national level institutions in Angola, national level institutions in Namibia, in Ghana and Togo as one thing that rules them all, but there is actually a lot of heterogeneity. They matter a lot, these characteristics, these institutional structures, where they are present, and they are much more likely to be present in parts, in kind of the urban centers and the capital cities. Okay, now, but then, with Elias, we kept on thinking, but then how is it, can we think that actually the hinterland and the rural areas are basically in anarchy? Are they unruly places? And of course not, they are not. But, this for us, again, we were wearing the hats of economists, gradually reading and, trying to figure out what is going on in these vast parts of the continent. So let's think about the local structures during the colonial period. So there is a lot of heterogeneity, of course, of how colonizers treated the various groups that they interacted with. But to a first approximation, colonizers in many parts of the continent, they did not alter dramatically the local ethnic structures. In fact, there is lots of evidence that particularly in British colonies, via the doctrine of indirect rule, often ethnic chiefs and kings were empowered, and they, and their role was actually legitimized through that. So if you read a bit about, there is of course lots of instances of discontinuity, lots of instances of change, but the inertia and the persistence of ethnic traits seems to be one key characteristic from the pre-colonial era throughout the colonial era and beyond. But then you start thinking, okay, now all these groups, they differ in many dimensions, right? They can differ in geography, they can differ in customs, in institutions, in the productive structure. So, for example, we have a lot of centralized states in the pre-colonial era, like the Zulu Kingdom, the Buganda Kingdom, or the Songhai. We had also large chiefdoms like the Wolof and the Ashanti in Western Africa, but also you had like quite a few Akefalo societies where basically there were no institutions, at least centralizing institutions across the villages of the societies. A typical example is the Nuer in Sudan. There is also a lot of variation in many other traits, like lineage systems, type of subsistence, practices in agriculture. But somehow, anthropologists, while they were basically becoming aware of the rich structures and the rich ethnic characteristics of the African continent, one thing that made them very aware of, like, this is a striking difference, goes back to basically anthropologists Fortes and Evans Pritchard, where they say, look, there is a lot of heterogeneity across groups in Africa, but one thing that stands out is how they kind of institutionally, the institutional arrangements. So they say, look, on the one hand, you can get societies where there is actually a centralized authority, an administrative machinery, judicial institutions, almost like a mini state in which cleavages of wealth, privilege, and status correspond to the distribution of power and authority. So now in the back of your mind, you could be thinking of the Zulu Kingdom, you could be thinking of the various other kingdoms of the African continent. And then, but on the other spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, you could actually have a lot of societies without any centralized authority. So there was actually an absence of government without these sharp divisions of rank and status. Okay, and Douglas, 1962, she's basically doing her field work in the Cuba and the Lele Kingdom and Cuba Kingdom, and she's struck basically by the difference in economic performance between these two adjacent groups. That they're separated by the Kasai River. On the one end of the bank, you have the Cuba Kingdom, a pretty developed place, and on the other hand, on the other end of the river, on the other, just opposite, you had the Lele, a relatively, decentralized and acephalous society without institutions with concomitant lower well-being than the Cuba. Okay, so basically, this already gives us an idea that there is this like features of institutional structures that they were very salient, at least during the pre-colonial era. And given that during the colonial era and the post-colonial period, these structures were not entirely wiped out, and often, in fact, they may have been used either by the colonizers or by the nascent governments in Africa, then it stands. Then Elias and I thought, could it be the case that actually it is this variation in pre-colonial centralization, in pre-colonial extent of state that might explain development across regions within the same country in Africa? So let's actually look at that. So first of all, are CIFs important or relevant for today in a bunch of different countries? So here is some evidence from Afrobarometer surveys in 2008, where basically they're being asked, this from 20 countries, and the respondents are being asked, how much influence do you think traditional leaders have in your community? So one striking thing is that roughly 50% of respondents, they would actually say that, look, traditional leaders are in fact relevant for whatever is going on at the local level. Some say a great deal, like almost 30%. So this gives you an idea that actually these structures, these traditional leaders, are relevant for understanding economic activity at the level that we're after. Okay, now, but how to get an idea of which groups are centralized, which groups are not centralized? Then we have to fall back again to George Peter Murdoch's work, which is the Ethnolinguistic Atlas, where he offers a compendium of characteristics, including basically the one on jurisdictional hierarchy above the local community level. There is a lot of work showing that there is a lot of measurement error in this map, in this classification, but also quite a bit of ground truth. Okay, so what we actually have, so we have a measure of the number of how centralized was the group in the pre-colonial era, starting from stateless societies to large centralized states. So here is basically the map that I was showing you earlier with the underlying groups, but now the groups have different colors. Darker colors depict the places where mini states with local administrative machinery in the pre-colonial era was present. Yellow states were more like the acephalous societies, the ones without any central administration. Okay, now one can show, and actually with Elias, this is what we did, that basically, let's say again, take two examples. We're in Zambia now. We have two groups that we can look at. The group on the west, that is on the left of your screen, you're looking at the Lamba, a centralized group in Zambia, and right next to it are the Lala on the east, which is an acephalous society. So we're within the same country. We're comparing neighboring groups. On one side, we have the centralized ones, and the other side, we have the less centralized, the acephalous ones. In the case of this group, of this pair, actually, the centralized group seems to have much more pixels lit in the night than the neighboring Lala. Now, is it the case across Africa? Do you actually get the same pattern? If you look within countries and you compare places, you compare neighboring ethnic groups, one that is centralized in the pre-colonial era to the guys next door that were actually acephalous during the pre-colonial era, what you will see today, that's what you will see. So here the positive numbers reflect the group that has the high quality local pre-colonial institutions, strong institutions. On the left side is basically ethnic groups without such legacies. And so you see clearly that the luminosity jumps as soon as you cross the border on the other side. So now this is within the same country, within Namibia, within Congo, within Zambia, that you get actually this picture. Now you may ask yourself, and I'll take 3 minutes to make this point, like why is that? Like why these structures still matter? I know from the surveys that the respondents tell me that, look, yes, traditional leaders are relevant, but you know why there is this variation? Why in the pre-colonial kingdoms in Africa, in African countries, these guys, these groups are actually doing so much better than the less centralized ones. I'm gonna basically focus on two outcomes. One is basically the pacifying role of centralization. So civil conflict, unfortunately, is a recurrent characteristic of post-independence Africa. And there is a lot of within-country variation. So some parts of the country would actually experience much more conflict than others. So there is actually some very nice papers by Emilio de Petri-Chauvin and Tore Wick that basically they show a few things. First of all, this is from the paper of Emilio de Petri-Chauvin, my student, that first of all, he says, look, let's improve upon the mapping of Murdoch about where states were during the pre-colonial era, but now he takes a longer horizon. He doesn't look only at what is the level of statehood as of early 19th century, but he looks basically over the last 1,000 years, poring over archival material and maps, and you can see kind of the evolution of statehood in different centuries, the last millennium. So then he takes these places and says, look, okay, in these parts of the world, of African continent, we have actually stronger imprint of statehood. What are we going to find? So here's when he gets this index together. So the darker places are the places that have experienced more statehood over the last, stronger statehood over the last millennium. And he's going to find actually that centralized groups have experienced on average significantly less conflict over the last 40 years. Survey respondents actually in these places, they report higher trust towards local policymakers and traditional leaders, hinting to the possibility that state legitimacy in these centralized groups is actually higher. Now, beautiful paper that I was recently made aware of is by Martha Wilford. She's a political scientist at Berkeley. And she does the following. She goes to Senegal and she's going to interview roughly 400 individuals from the local elites. So what is the context? We're in Senegal, where decentralization efforts have taken place the last, starting in 1996. There is some power towards local governments and some fiscal resources given in order to empower the local governments and the local councils with also various responsibilities. Of course, this is incomplete, but that's a kind of a move towards giving more power to the local communities. So what she finds out, what's her argument? Her argument is that, look, in the pre-colonial states within Senegal, that is regions in Senegal that belong to pre-colonial states, then she expects to find a higher cohesion, stronger social ties across villages from a shared descent from the pre-colonial state. And this cohesion across elites, the village elites, would lead basically to a better coordination of projects and that local governments would work better. What examples she has in mind? She has in mind examples like the Luga group, the Fatika, the Futotoro. And on the other end, you have the historically acephalous societies, the societies that they did not have a similar network, a similar machinery of pre-colonial institutional connections across villages, where she makes the point that there one would expect to find much more fragmentation across the local elites in the different villages that would hamper the local development by this intra-elite split. So what she does, first of all, she goes beyond Murdoch map and says, look, I'm going to basically pour through both oral accounts and archives in Senegal to find out where exactly the states were in the late 1800s. So that's what she produces, a map of stronger states in stronger groups in terms of institutional capacity states in the beginning of 19th century. Okay, and then what is she actually finding? She's finding through these interviews that groups that have a pre-colonial state in them, they raise much more taxes, roughly 51%, compared to the acephalous societies in Senegal that they have a very hard time raising taxes. The difficulty of the problems, the difficulty with projects that are being mentioned by the interviewees is not that the pre-colonial states are problem-free. In fact, there is lots of problems. But compared to the acephalous societies, it is just 60% of the time that interviewees in pre-colonial states would say we have difficulty with the projects, whereas it is 80% of the time in acephalous societies. And how about whether decentralization, which is a big move in the context of many different countries in Africa, whether it works? How do the local elites think? Well, in pre-colonial states, the elite thinks that roughly 65% of the elite thinks that actually it works. It's decentralization can lead to an improvement in our livelihoods. It's only 50% actually among the acephalous societies. Okay, of course, I don't want to get something out of here that pre-colonial centralization is a destiny. It's not. There is actually very interesting work recently by Belinda Archibong and another very nice piece by Bauer, Plattas, and Weinstein that delve into these intricate and very interesting interactions between how these traditional kings, traditional leaders fell on the wrong side of either the post-colonial masters or the colonial masters. So in the context of Nigeria, Belinda makes the point that, look, if you look at the historically centralized regions in Nigeria, you will actually see them that today they are less developed in terms of having lower access to certain public services. What she has in mind, how she rationalizes this finding, is that actually centralized leaders that were compliant with the autocrats, they actually received more federally controlled services, and those that were not, they were punished. And this punishment has long-term consequences for the livelihood of these regions. Bauer, Plattas, and Weinstein, in another recent paper, they look at across centralized societies across Africa, and they make the key observation that, look, places, groups that were, that the leader upon colonization was Muslim, so Islamic states in the pre-colonial era are worse off today compared to areas governed by traditional or Christian kingdoms. So that's what they bring out as evidence. And what is the mechanism? They say that, look, Islamic states actually suffered a reversal between the pre-colonial period and the contemporary period because of the limited colonial investments that they received, including almost no missionary activity, with missionary activity being often responsible for the installment of health clinics and schools during the colonial era. Okay, so what is the message I think that we can take out of this work so far is that it seems that within Africa, there is a dual institutional framework across many African regions. And what mediates the quality of the relationship between national level actors and local actors is the historical legacy of the groups. So I think that that's kind of what we learned as economists, and we brought back to our economics understanding of local development in Africa. There is lots of exciting work in terms of mechanisms, since we initially documented this positive correlation between development and pre-colonial centralization, but much remains to be uncovered. Heterogeneity, we keep on thinking and we keep on learning actually. So I hope that much more work will come out of it. There is several issues that I'm sure we will get to that when Warren takes the floor. Now, of course, you may be thinking, but why some places got more? Why some places centralized institutions were more common rather than others? That's why we have tomorrow Marcela Alsan and James Fenske to walk us through several of the arguments that have been made. For now, I yield the virtual floor to Warren, and I look forward to his talk.
Okay, I'd like to begin by thanking the conveners of this class for inviting me to talk to this group. They've assembled an amazing group of scholars who I believe have been pioneers in the resurgence of economic explorations into the sources of African development over the long term, locally, by state, a variety of different ways. I've been asked to talk about pre-colonial political centralization in Africa, what economists know about this. Just a moment. Just a moment. Where's my, there we go. Listening to Stelios, this area is moving so fast. I would love to get a copy of his slides. There are things and recent studies at a local level that I am not aware of. In a sense, they contextualize what I have to say today. But political centralization, important for a variety of reasons, primarily as a context for taxation, provision of public goods like protection of citizenry, which I will spend a lot of time talking about today, control of immigration, infrastructure development, and things of that nature. Now, by the end of the quote unquote pre-colonial era, I hate that term pre-colonial, as if nothing came before it and that demarcates the beginning of something. Europe's more centralized than Africa. Might this help explain differences in income? Inside Africa, an index of pre-colonial political centralization, what Stelios just talked about, is correlated with variations in the provisioning of public goods like roads, streets, and income and institutions 100 years later, okay, long time. This raises a whole host of questions within the economics profession that has to do with things like path dependence, persistence, legacy, the fact that whether or not history really matters a lot. And so some interpret this as the origins of modern events like politics. I am sort of critical of using that word to talk about this historical precedence for current outcomes. Now, what is this index of pre-colonial political centralization? Well, it's a variable in Murdoch's ethnographic atlas, sort of a snapshot of situation circa 1900. It really varies late 1800s to up to 1930. But Murdoch claims that he's trying to code the ethnographic literature so that this reflects the situation before it's contaminated by colonial rule. Maybe, maybe not. It's based on Swanson. If you read the ethnographic publication where he presents this variable, he states very clearly that it's based on this book, The Birth of the Gods, and is designed to pick up executive power, the ability and legitimacy of higher order chiefs and social strata to direct activities below, influence life. Now there's literature on Europe that argues that the source of late 18th, early 19th century growth in Europe is correlated with weaknesses of executive power. There, the executive's the king. So that sort of critique of this particular perspective helps you sort of put in a kind of implicit sequence of what this literature, and in particular the ethnographic atlas, is coding. This view that in Africa, the executive power is important, Europe less so, as if Africa is a pre-stage, it's pre-modern accumulation of power that then, as they want to advance further, will decentralize as Europe did. I'm not so sure that's the only way to view what's going on. For critique, you could see Susan Keach McIntosh's collection of essays, Beyond Chiefdom, Pathways to Complexity in Africa. And there's some interesting case studies of how societies were able to expand their scope and complexity without creating large hierarchies and principal-agent relationships across space. But most important, this pre-colonial centralization is an outcome of a prior history. Now, economists don't know what that prior history is, although what Stelios presented today is some recent studies that I would definitely like to consult to adjust my views on this, maybe. Here you see a map, for example, of some major cities circa 1500 from Chandler and Fox, 3,000 years of urban growth. And you see a map of political centralization circa 1900 from George Murdoch's Ethnographic Atlas. There's no obvious correlation between early cities and later centralization. You would think that cities require the kind of protection of citizenry that political centralization affords, but you don't see much correlation there. You see some clusters, though. You see some clusters around the Niger River, the Bight of Benin. But really, if you know the history there, not so much, nowhere near as much as you would expect from the pre-colonial histories of Ghana, Mali, Ife, Benin, etc. You would expect a lot more political centralization to have emerged there. And then you see a cluster along the Great Rift from Axiom to Timbuktu. And Murdoch has some ideas here about it being a copper zone and the varied ecology and how plants and animals migrated along these rift valleys. Explorers like Stanley Livingston has some great observations of how the social structures varied as you moved from the coast through the interior and across to the other coast. Okay, so there's a lot of work that can be done, and I'm pleased to see that Stelios was able to report some recent work on things like this. Now, what we do know, though, is that the slave trade intervenes between 1500 and 1900. And here I'd like to talk a bit from a forthcoming article of mine coming out in the Journal of Economic History, entitled How the International Slave Trades Underdeveloped Africa. Now, that article is not particularly focused on the impact of the slave trade on political centralization. I'm actually focusing on the overall transformation of African economies that were exposed to international slave trades. And I want to see how the social structures and cultures responded to the exposure of capture and the trade and the wealth created by slave capture. Okay, so there are some effects on political centralization, but these are different by region. So I'm going to get into some regional differences here in the histories. Of course, the slave trades have different histories and they affected different coasts. But the most interesting finding is how exposure to the slave trade spread interlocking bundles of institutions, and only one of which was sometimes centralization. But it gives us a sense of what centralization is being correlated with in some regions. So it's this interlocking bundle of institutions and rights that I'll be most interested in. So how do I get this? Well, I develop an index of what I call travel time to the nearest slave port, and I use this to capture exposure to international slave trades. The idea here being, the quasi-natural experiment being that the slave ports are established in accordance with the natural ports and harbors along the coast, not with the characteristics of the societies that they're going to interact with. So therefore, the distance between those societies and these ports is not picking up anything about the structure of these societies other than their proximity to these ports. And then I look at to see if the proximity to these ports varies or changes the characteristics of society. So I build this travel time, a lot of work, get some estimates of walking and head load rates of walking, traveling over the terrain, add in canoe speeds and river velocity, control for up and downhill effects on rates of travel, and include measures of the tsetse fly's suitability to capture the possibility of using horses and camels. Okay. Here's what I get. Average travel time to the nearest slave port for societies in the ethnographic atlas. I take the cell measures from the ArcGIS estimate of distances between cells in a grid that covers Africa and these ports. And I aggregate them for each ethnicity that we find in Murdoch's ethnographic atlas. And these are the hours of travel. The darkest one is 404 to 595 hours. Okay, I do that for the transatlantic, Indian Ocean, Sahel ports. Okay. Now, first I look at exposure of societies to international slave trading. The idea here is that the capture of slaves creates slave wealth. How did the trade of this wealth to international slave ports impact the institutional structure of societies and economies along the way? So to address the question, I estimate the impact of proximity to the nearest international slave port and its effect on the probability that a society that we observe was organized around the preservation of slave wealth. Now, here's the bundle of rights that I play around with. Slavery as a property right over people. Polygyny as a property right over women and wives, inheritance rules that favor the retention of wealth within the nuclear family as opposed to the clan or the tribe, family-based wealth. Hereditary succession in local politics that I coin as landed aristocracy, and political centralization beyond the local level. And this is our measure of centralization that's used in the literature. Now, here are some findings on singular rights when I look at changes in singular rights as the society is closer or away from a port. For all of Africa, and this is a general result, exposure to slave trading spread African slavery. Okay, now, the second one is for all of Africa, exposure to slave trading spread African slavery and polygyny together. And this is a very, very strong result, which is why I present it to you as if it's a singular right. It's always there. Proximity to trans-Saharan slave ports reduced political centralization, especially in West Africa. And there's no systematic effect on political centralization along the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Okay. So that's one set of results. And you can see the regional variation in the effects of the slave trades. Now, in East Africa, we start to see the emergence of a bundle of interlocking institutions as one moves closer to a slave port. And this bundle I call polygynous family-based slavery. So polygyny is slavery, of course, but family-based in the sense that there's a family-based inheritance of wealth being practiced. The probability is around 60% if you're adjacent to a port that your social structure will look like this. 40% probability 20 days out. Now, on the East Coast, this declines slowly, primarily because there are a few coastal ports on the East Coast, and the Dow ship was used to integrate coastal society. So you really didn't have to be that close to a port to feel the effects of exposure to the slave trade. And there was a Swahili coastal trade diaspora that facilitated this coastwise connection. None of this is captured in the measure of travel time that we use. Okay, next result. In West Africa, what we see is an addition to this bundle of institutions, aristocratic family-based polygynous slavery. And so here we're adding, or societies are adding, hereditary succession in local politics. An aristocracy is involved in whatever is emerging here within proximity to an international slave port. And that this family-based polygynous slavery only shows up and evolves under the protection of a local aristocracy. The probability is lower adjacent to a port, and it dies out faster. And in the literature, we encounter this as the effects of the slave trade being coastal, confined to coast in West Africa. In West Africa, we also see a bundling that adds political centralization beyond the local level. This is a centralization variable that Stelios talked about. So we get politically centralized, aristocratic, family-based polygynous slavery. It's getting kind of long here. Pretty high probability if you're adjacent to a port, but it dies out real quickly. Now, I looked at these and I said, well, you know, people might say that West Africa, that all of this is confined to the coast. And I went back and looked at some other variables here and other graphs that I have here, results. And here's one for the probability of aristocratic slavery as you approach a trans-Saharan Red Sea port. And you can see here it's pretty high and it declines rather slowly. You can go far, far from a Sahel slave port and you still find effects of exposure. And that's primarily because of the availability of camels and horses in the Sahel. Okay, so West Africa is sort of being squeezed by the trans-Saharan and the Atlantic slave trades. Now, there are many possible explanations for the regional differences. A lot more settlement and development of commodity export enclaves in East Africa. Europeans actually settled, Omani, Swahili as well, set up slave plantations, focused towards export trade. And this happens late in our period, around in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And we could be picking that up in East Africa. In West Africa, we sort of get an indigenous linear slavery. Europeans did not settle and produce in West Africa. What we're seeing is systems emerging out of long-term exposure of lineage systems, first to the trans-Saharan and then to the explosive transatlantic slave trade. Now, I also can get some results on the effects of exposure to capture on the spread of African slavery, which was really my central focus in this paper. And here I use some data from Nunn and Washington on data on the origins, the spatial origins of exported captives. I use travel time to estimate how many exported captives can be explained by the proximity of these people to the closest slave port. Then I look to see if this estimate of exported captives that's correlated with proximity to ports is correlated with the probability of those people subject to capture adopted slavery. And I find this result here that's graphed in this paper you see. The centralized societies at the end of the slave trade era, and I can only say at the end of this era, are slave regardless of exposure, having a history of exposure to capture, or just sending folks into the international slave trades. Decentralized groups at the end of the slave trade era have adopted slavery, probably to defend against further enslavement. And if you substitute just Euclidean straight line distance to the coast for travel time that takes into account the topography of travelers to and from these slave ports, then you miss all of this, that you find no effects whatsoever from exposure to slave ports, and no effect whatsoever on the export of captives on the probability of these societies adopting slavery to defend against further enslavement. Now, there's some examples of catchment effects here. I don't think I have much time to go through this literature, and it's only illustrative. No one's ever really. There's a model that I developed with Rob Gilzo that sort of captures the general geopolitical history of the Guinea coast during the 18th century expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, and how you observe the emergence of centralized interior but close coastal slave raiding states like Ashanti, Dahomey, and the Sokoto Caliphate. Diouf talks about decentralized sites fighting back. Hawthorne has a great discussion of the Balanta as they moved into closer clusters to protect themselves, but to do so, they had to get steel to grow rice that can be produced on smaller plots of land. And how this transformed their society, because in order to get the iron, to produce these tools, they had to themselves engage in the slave trade. That was the high demand export product that would allow them to purchase the iron they needed. In the process, they had to adopt slavery to justify and support those activities. Harms talks about the Bobangi along the Congo River. Roberts talks about the Bambara and the Segu transformation, which has to do with a breakdown in age sets and how the oldest age sets rebelled. And in order to sustain their rebellion, recruited other slaves to fight the old order. Okay, so these are examples of how exposure to slave trading and slave capture can lead to societies adopting slavery. So some conclusions here from this exercise. Centralization means something different regionally. Now, the Zulu region in Southeast Africa, interestingly, is the only centralized region that shows up in the ethnographic atlas without slavery. And we know the history as it works out there, the Nfokana and the trek inland from the coast. The histories of centralization, this is, I guess, the third lesson. The histories of centralization in Europe and Africa are not independent of each other. centralization in Europe is expanding the slave trade as European centralized empires spread out across the world. And this process is influencing centralization and development in Africa. So be careful about interpreting this as a sequence in the development process, where Africa coming earlier than Europe. Historians wouldn't make that mistake, but economists could. And going forward, centralization in West Africa is closely tied to slavery, polygyny, inheritance patterns, and landed aristocratic control. So it provides a context for the history of labor and unfree labor under colonial occupation. It's a context within which customary authority is established and the shape of that customary authority that is established under colonialism. And customary authority is still influential across Africa today. Now, here's a shameless plug for my forthcoming book, The Making of the Other: How Black Africa Became the Mirror Image of White Europe. And it explores similar processes across a variety of societal features. The basic argument is that the slave trades made them more different. On the left, you see features or traits that we usually associate with European economies and societies, and how it evolved over this age of revolution, 1500 to 1900. In Africa, that's the slave trade. In Europe, it's usually referred to as the age of revolution, where freedom emerges, monogamy spreads, psychology becomes more individualistic, political centralization, flowering of democracy, establishment of the rule of law, patriarchy, racism, and economic development and growth. Now, what the slave trades do is spread slavery in Africa, spreads polygamy, ethnic identity, political decentralization, aristocracy, aristocratic control, customary authority, even matrilineal. I'm able to show how the slave trades increase the probability that societies would adopt a matrilineal descent rule. Ethnic stratification, and the sum of all these I call under development. So that's what I have to discuss today. Thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Stelios and Warren, for your presentation. I think they're quite enlightening to all of us. There are several questions that have been asked, and I think I'll start with Stelios. Maybe pose 3 questions before I pose the other 3 questions to Warren, based on what people have sent forward. The first part, Stelios, people are asking, how do you define ethnicity? And then, isn't the work of Murdoch severely compromised by the colonial gaze? Haven't there been drastic changes in Africa since then? I think since the work of Murdoch. The other very common question that people are asking about is, how do you define national institutions? Okay, how do you define national institutions in this case? Does the Western system of institutionalization not necessarily work in Africa? Okay, does the Western system of institutionalization not necessarily work in Africa? And perhaps for now, the last question I'll ask Stelios is, was the partition of Africa a one-off decision during the conference at Berlin, or did it start much earlier? And then how can African leaders today become part and parcel of the global decision-making process? So perhaps you can answer those, and then I'll ask Warren a few other questions based on what people have sent forward.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alfred. These are all great questions. So one is harder than the other. So I'll make sure I answer them to the best of my powers, but I'm sure there will be lots of to be told. So how do we define ethnicity? So you see, there is a huge debate about how to even conceive the notion of ethnicity, right? So you could get the two polar opposites of thinking about ethnicity. On the one hand, you could have, let's call it the primordialist view that views groups as kind of flowers, that is, they are endemic in a given place, they are hard set, they're hardwired, deeply rooted. And then there's the other view, right? The polar opposite view that views them as an outcome of a choice, practically, or a choice or an assignment to a group. So the way we are approaching, or we started approaching this project, was to say that, first of all, if you want, so that's the problem that Western academics had, how to embrace diversity. Once you embrace diversity, you have to define what do you mean by the unit that constitutes eventually the diverse set of people. So, and this is a fraught argument, right? How you define people. So linguistically, it's a safer way to go. So you can think that linguists have a way to actually categorize dialects, categorize languages in terms of their distance. So I think the safest way to think about what is a group is to think about the linguistic endowment of this group. And that is also something that Murdoch is using in his classification of people. Now the second element of this first question is that how much can we trust Murdoch's data, right? So they were, Murdoch, first of all, it compiles data. He's never himself has been to Africa, so he did not conduct primary research, but basically he's like a compiling all kind of research that has been done during the 20th century, and through a series of installments, he basically comes up with kind of a compendium, a catalog of characteristics of groups, not only in Africa but also for the world as a whole. So, how biased is Murdoch? Is as biased as the underlying resources, as the underlying sources that are being used. Now, but let me take a step back. For example, let's think about this pre-colonial centralization that Ilias and I have taken as an article of faith. So you see, every time you need to make an argument, you need to construct something, and then you construct, and then you need to use some building blocks, and then you have an argument. Now, as research improves and gets better, you start deconstructing the same argument, finding out which are the weaknesses and which are the strengths, so that you can actually move on with an improved model of the same argument. So the two papers that I briefly talked at the end of my presentation from Martha Wilford and Emilio de Petri-Chauvin, there was an honest effort to try to move away from Murdoch and say, okay, let's actually consult different accounts. And you can always say that, look, if you keep on consulting the same archives written by the same people, you're going to keep up getting to the same answer just because your sources do not change. So this is why I view particularly nice this piece by Martha Wilford, that she actually relies on local oral histories, that asks the people, do you remember that there was actually some group here, some kings here? Can you remember their names? So she actually gets to see whether the lineages have some memory of some great past of centralized societies, or actually that was not the case for this particular place. So which I found very, very interesting, right? That actually you can learn from Africans on the ground about through their oral histories of how much error there is in our archival understanding. Okay, now that's one piece. Second piece, how do we define national institutions? For that one, we are basically behaving like economists. What does this mean? We're going to the World Bank. World Bank says, South Africa has this level of national institutional quality in terms of rule of law or control of corruption. This is the number for South Africa. This is the number for Togo. How they come up with these numbers, they send basically, for example, for the control of corruption, what they do, they send out questionnaires to firms that are active in Johannesburg or in other parts of South Africa or the main cities in the various African countries. And they ask, the owners of the firms, how often did you have to pay a bribe? Were you ever asked for a bribe? What was the amount of the bribe? And so on and so forth. So then they get, if you ask thousands of firms and thousands of entrepreneurs, you can get some idea about, the degree of corruption or the control of corruption in a given country. Now, Alfred, for that, you asked about the appropriateness of institutions, and how much extrapolating from what, Western institutions, whether they work in the West, they would actually work also in Africa. That's a huge question. As economists, we would like to think that, safeguarding incentives and safeguarding the fruits of your labor and your investment is a very important element for subsequently, investing on it, trying, putting effort, saving in order to come up and be more entrepreneurial, invest on your own human capital, and so on and so forth. So you see, this is kind of ingrained in our understanding of how markets work. Now, the deeper question is, are the markets the only solution to all problems? And that's a long debate, and I would, but that's my train of thinking. And now the final thing is about the partitioning of Africa that started in the Berlin Conference. Already. So we just heard like a beautiful, exposition by Warren that, of course, it does not all start at a given point in time. It's a sequence of events. And then we have to start from somewhere. So, Berlin Conference is actually an important one, at least for the delineation of some properties of how colonizers would actually allocate African territory among themselves. We'll talk much more about this in a few weeks. I yield the floor to you.
Thank you, Stelios, for those responses that you provided. Now, for Warren, I think one of the most striking thing that has come out of your presentation is on the slave trade. So there are several questions on the slave trade, and one of them says, how did the African slave trade tie into the global economy? Did the slave trade underdevelop Africa? And then the other related questions say, why is there no mapping on African slaves in the Middle East? And lastly, wait a minute.
Can you repeat that third question?
Why is there no mapping or perhaps discussion on African slaves that were taken to the Middle East? That is in your presentation. And then lastly, what determined the location of the slave trade ports? What determined the location of the slave trade ports on the coast of Africa? Thank you.
Global economy. It is a central feature, the slave trade, central feature of the expansion of the global economy. Eric Williams' book on capitalism and slavery is the modern beginning of this debate, and it rages on today. The importance of slavery to the development of institutions in Europe, and Corey's work on financial markets, on insurance and banking, on shipping. The slave trade is the source of all of these developments in the sense that it dominated these industries in the early era, especially during the 18th century, when Europe is full-fledged involved in the making and the remaking of society. Even the financial revolution in England that predates the Industrial Revolution by almost a century, where the London stock market is being established and expanded, and where the centralized government of England, represented by Parliament now, democratic centralized government, is consolidating its debt and trying to convert it to stocks traded on this emerging stock market using the South Sea Company. A paper I've recently published with Gregory Price on this shows how giving the South Sea Company a monopoly on slave trading influenced the stock price of the South Sea Company and facilitated this consolidation of debt, expansion, origins, I might say, of the London stock market and the financial revolution in England. So very much a part of what's going on in Europe, especially in the 18th century. By the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution taking off, productivity growth in the West is beginning to swamp the slave trade effect on productivity. But that whole process has been pushed back to the 18th century, where we find the beginnings of these European transformations that predate the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution is not the defining feature here. Did it underdevelop Africa? I believe that it did. The question, and that was my last slide in a sense, outlining how I think it underdeveloped Africa, and precisely what we can begin to mean by the term underdevelopment. I hate to say, Africa and the European mirror, but there's so much out there that implies, that Africa and Europe are at different stages in some development process, and that they're independent observations over time. I think that's a huge mistake, and hopefully this book that I'm writing will address that issue square on. Why no mapping in the Middle East? Good question. Capitalists keep good records. The Indian Ocean trade was less capital. Now, I have stories here. Way back in 1974, I actually spent a lot of time as an exchange student at the University of Baghdad, Iraq. And we drove down to Kuwait to buy a Volkswagen and then drove from there on to Europe. Could do that back then. I don't know if you could do it now. But as you pass through Basra in southern Iraq on your way to Kuwait, we saw lots of people of African descent. And what stood out most in my mind was that they were carrying briefcases and they were dressed in suits. It was just clear to me, etched in my mind, that there was some kind of Black power happening there. Well, just last week comes across my desk that the state news agency has hired its first Black newswoman, and that she's not so sure. I don't know how much of this is her public stance or not, but she's not so sure there is any Black power in Iraq. But it's clear to me that back then, Basra was a seat of Black power, and that's where the Zanj rebellion and where Africans were sent to Baghdad, to Iraq rather, to drive and work the salt mines in the south. So that's one example of a historical mapping that is probably lost over time. Unfortunately, Basra is where the U.S. staged their invasion of Kuwait in the first Middle East War. Who knows what happened after that? But it's a story, I think, that remains to be told. The last question, the determinants of the location of slave puts usually at the mouths of rivers to facilitate the transport of goods inland and out, often on islands as protected strongholds, and in bays, protected bays, sometimes slightly upriver, but mostly to protect the access to the coast. If any of you are sailors or even motorboaters, you know that to get to shore in rough places, you have to have some kind of protection along the coast. And this was clearly the case back in the day. They had no idea what it looked like in the interior. In fact, as late as 1790 something, Mungo Park, the Scottish explorer, travels along the Sahel and makes some observations about societies along the Niger Bend as it enters the Sahara Desert. And the title of his book was Travels in the Interior of Africa. Okay, so they really knew very little about the interior. David Livingstone is one of the first to actually give us some very good observations on what was going on in the interior of Africa. Traders had no idea whatsoever. And actually Cohen argues that they had less of an idea as time went on.
Thank you, Alfred. Thank you, Stelios. Thank you, Warren. And thank you all. We received more than 200 questions. Nathan, I, and the team were trying to respond to many of those. We're very honored to try to respond to these questions. As always, by Monday, we will send concrete answers to some of those questions in more detail. Let me also make a note here. As Warren very eloquently made the point, those quote-unquote periods of African history intermingle, and neither Stelios nor Nathan nor Leonard subscribe to the core distinction: slave trade period, pre-colonial, colonial, post-independence. There's considerable overlap, and that's why actually we wanted to feature Warren in his discussion on the slave trade in today's session to show this continuity. Nathan Nunn, in week 4, so in 2 weeks from now, will delve into many of those questions that have been asked about the legacy of the slave trades. And also next week, he will start discussing more issues related to polygyny, to gender rights, issues that many of you asked today. Sticking to this week, let me conclude with what to expect. So tomorrow we will be very honored and pleased to have 2 amazing researchers, Marcella Alsan from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and Jim Fenske from Warwick University in the United Kingdom. Both of them have written very important papers on the origins of pre-colonial African institutions, which is a natural question given the discussion that we had with Stelios and Warren today. As a generic point, what shapes statehood and institutions is perhaps the oldest question in social sciences. It's not only about Africa, it's much broader. And I look forward to the interventions of Marcy and Jim. Besides, we have received many questions both last week and also this week on data, on how can we map African development and more general development outside the continent. What are the problems, for example, of GDP? What are the issues with the national institutions measures as compiled by the World Bank? So on Thursday at 3 p.m., we will have a special session with Tanner Regan. He will present various approaches that we can use to map spatial development, zooming in Africa, but this discussion will be of much greater interest. Let me all thank you. It is stunning that we have such a huge participation. Thank you all for your remarks. Keep emailing us at the course and the lecture series email. We really want to hear from you. Let me remind you that we released a questionnaire and we look forward to your remarks. Please send us comments, respond to the questions, be as open. What Leonard, Nathan, Stelios, and I and all our guests want is to have this as interactive as possible, and we'll do our best to do so. Thank you all. See you all tomorrow.